we'll have Peter Kirn come up and speak to us about when we get fixed on things that we look at. Now, Peter is a former student of Dr. Nikki Guninder Kaur, who works off of her translations in studying the work and the poetry of Bhai Vir Singh. So we're now looking at the perspective of an artist and a poet. Peter Kirn works on a 56-acre raw milk dairy farm in southern Maine, and he earned his MFA in poetry from Drew University in New Jersey. His poems appear or are forthcoming in the Normal School Literary Journal, Organs of Vision and Speech, Otis Nebula, and Upstairs at Duroc. His first collection of poetry, The Intimacy with Which Stone Combusts and Praising the Nervous Life, will be published this winter. His presentation is going to look at several of Bhai Vir Singhji's poems as a study of exactly how his work performs the tightrope walk of clarity and nuance in the face of ecstasy, wonder, and intense desire, and ultimately investigates how and why his work can always be relied upon for guidance and focus. Please welcome Peter Kirn.
Good morning. I want to start by thanking the Sikh Research Institute for having me. It's an honor and humbling to be included, and my thoughts about this poet whose work has meant so much to me might matter at all to anyone, but I guess you guys don't know what those thoughts are yet, so I guess that's a mouthful. I also want to thank Professor Nikki Singh, who introduced me to Bhai Vir Singh's work almost a decade ago now. It's been a formative experience, and one that I hope that this paper will show is a constant instrument of growth. Professor Singh has been there for me as a mentor time and time again, with a thoroughness, enthusiasm, and professionalism that is inspiring and moving, so thank you. When we get fixed on things we look at, Bhai Vir Singh and the refocusing of the poetic eye. The work of Bhai Vir Singh arrived in my hands at precisely the right time. An undergraduate senior studying postmodern poetry and creative writing, my understanding of poetics was full of supposed certainties and ripe for the dismantling that I found in the uniquely incisive and ecstatic voice of Singh's work. As both a reader and writer, I was seeing the world of poetry as a world of schools, camps, and isms. Singh entered this monolithic view as a medium, this monolithic view of the medium as a complete original, an outsider to this stifled outlook. Singh's language never seemed to make what had come to seem like an inevitable, ironic divergence with its meaning. I found and continue to find in Bhai Vir Singh's poetry a voice and worldview which is ecstatic yet reliable, serious but not overly dramatic. I found love poems in which the love is requited and unrequited at once, and the speaker's love and attention simultaneously reciprocated and left lingering. Excuse me. And left. Singh's speakers arrive at a place of peace with their struggles without finding an end to them. The speaking voice in Singh's worth is both humbled and humbling, aware of its own immense desire and moved to an ecstatic marveling at the world's capacity to assuage and dwarf that desire. At a time when my life as a reader was stagnating and my life as a young writer was feeling formulaic, Bhai Vir Singh turned up to do for the first time what his work continues to do for me: rattle my certainties, renew my capacity for wonder and clarity, and inspire an ongoing search for truth. First, a quick bit of background. A mainstay of my undergraduate studies in contemporary American poetry was identifying ironic distance, where the speaker's tone and the text's literal meaning diverged, as well as identifying slippages between the philosophical, thematic, or ideological poles laid out in a text, and in so doing, investigating the nuanced work that a poem can accomplish, in its best moments. Unfortunately, this resulted for me in in an eye trained to isolate these traits in poems that they may be studied and made sense of as if they didn't make sense already. I was suddenly looking at a poem and not asking, is there irony at play here, but where is it? Similarly, the totality of a poem was now a function of its bifurcated tones and contents. And the work of the poets whose work I loved and continue to love, like Frank O'Hara, whose poem, Steps, you will find in your handout, I honed in on how moments of emotional intensity, candidness, and openness were often tempered with a snarky realism, how opposites in euphony and subject matter interplayed. The result was a fractured view of the medium, even if the overall intention of breaking down a poem was to understand how it was working as a whole. I had, as a reader, lost the forest for the trees. As a young writer, this model of tempering unguardedness and intimacy with humor and detached realism crystallized into an unshakable model. The balance rooted in this style of composition had a reputation for humanizing a speaker, slashing the existing poet stereotype as an insufferably emotional and serious, and yes, giving range to the scope of a poem by zooming far enough out of one's own emotional investment in the subject matter to see with humor or desire or despair the broader cultural landscape of which the microcosm of a poem is only a small part. The first thing that appealed to me about Bhai Vir Singh's work is that it resists these treatments completely and these analytical tactics. Singh's voice, as I came to know it through Nikki Guninder Kaur's Singh's translation Cosmic Symphony, was, for this reason, completely fresh. What had come to be a reductive, formulaic lens for exploring a poem exploded under the intense lyricism of Bhai Vir Singh's work, as we see in I Am Sad to See the World Suffer. And these are all translations from Professor Singh's work. Seeing the world suffer, my heart sinks lower and lower. My inside melts like wax. Tears wet my cheeks. Even if we may sacrifice ourselves, the world still suffers. Yet we cannot turn to stone. Seeing the world suffer, I'm sad. Here, the soft S sounds, coupled with the repetition of the words lower and suffer and the rhyming therein, amount to a gentle, sympathetic, disarming sonic landscape, which is born of the speaker's utter candidness. This intimate tone is underscored by the way the poem takes us from a wide scope of the world in the first line, on a journey in which we sink lower and lower to the speaker's inside, and inside made all the more real by the deft deployment of the image of those insides melting. Our interior setting and the profound sense of manipulability pervading the poem through the words melt and cannot turn to stone, and the relentlessness of Singh's intimate, revealing language evoke profoundly, unceasingly, and economically the truth about the unendingness and shape-shifting nature of despair. Singh's lyricism is, to my mind and ear, so effective that the tone of the poem need not be managed or mitigated with ironic distance, and the speaker seems also to fall outside the boundaries of the insufferable, whiny poet stereotype because of the truth so seemingly effortlessly evoked about the shared experience of sadness in a troubled world. To this end, when we read the almost childishly simplistic last line, seeing the world suffer, I am sad, it reads not as infantile, but bold. The poem is in a way a definition poem of the sadness the speaker refers to, its profundity, its way of rendering us completely emotionally raw. I am reminded of the great Brazilian poet Adélia Prado, who demands of poetry not the word, the thing, exactly. Singh's poem, we experience his definition of sadness, the whole poem somehow poured into the last word and the final gesture. Singh animates in us a serious interior place which the poem describes sonically, spatially, and imagistically, and demonstrates how our despair for the suffering of the world lives there, expressing finally how sadness both occupies and is full of that space. I am sad to see the world suffer demonstrates a major distinction between the way I enter a Bhai Vir Singh poem as opposed to a contemporary American poem. As in the opera poem in the handout, the American poems I was reading at the time seemed to rely on our shared experience of ephemera and culture as our access point to enter and explore the profound interior space presented in I Am Sad to See the World Suffer. In Steps, O'Hara is whirled into a frenzy by the city, and in that maelstrom we are swept into the rapture and isolation felt by the speaker. But Singh just barely touches the world in this poem, which is, save the very first line, situated in the speaker's emotional, spiritual interior. When the idea of seeing, even the idea of seeing the world suffer in Singh's poem suggests the degree of removal between the world and the speaker. The alienated standpoint rings profoundly true in Singh's treatment of despair and pain, and ultimately sympathy. Indeed, the project of the poem is a difficult sell to a 21st century cynic like myself. There is a meaningful emotional experience born of the never-ending suffering of our comrades and the growth to be found in the plodding ever forward without turning to stone. Yet, Singh makes a deep-seated, concise case for such meaningful experience. This case comes from a deftly managed tone and unwavering honesty, which seems to be a hallmark of Singh's work. The poet's use of everyday language, straightforward syntax, and the speaker's willingness to engage in tender emotional ground is disarming to the cynicism that might turn a reader away, and to my ear, bypasses in its colloquialism the drab, pessimistic poet stereotype. To this end, Singh's work bucks the idea of tempering tenderness and candor with callousness. For me, this is a welcome shakeup. Though I didn't know it at the time, I found inspiration in the true artistry of Bhai Vir Singh's work. That is, it is so true to its own vision that it comes across as effortless and even simple. I've been reminded often in working on this paper of what the poet Gerald Stern said about the poet Jean Valentine. I don't know of a less ironic poet. And as true as that is for Bhai Vir Singh, the poet's disinclination to employ irony does not in any way limit the range of the work. Quite the opposite. Like the novelist Haruki Murakami, I Am Sad to See the World Suffer is a plain-spoken, deeply artistic descent into the inner space of the psyche. The scope of the poem is so focused in the speaker's interior that it blossoms into a shared experience. The change the speaker undergoes in the poem is to realize that part of the nature of sadness is its bottomlessness. The poem is, in this way, the very model of humility in the face of a grandeur being learned in real time. As a writer, I was moved and inspired by the all-encompassing feel of the dark space in Singh's lyric poetry. The way he seems to generate his own oxygen in I Am Sad to See the World Suffer, particularly in the use of such everyday diction and syntax, was something I noticed making its way into my own work almost immediately. And the way silence in the poem evokes a visual darkness seems it will forever be an aspiration of mine. It gave me an immense amount of confidence to experience a poet whose work seemed to assemble an entire atmosphere and compel the reader to breathe it. And when one of the criticisms of my work was that it seemed to want to create its own worlds, it was in Bhai Vir Singh that I found the confidence to see this as a positive. For Singh's work is deeply transportive, not wildly visual, surreal, or magical realistic, but when I am in a Bhai Vir Singh poem, I know there is no other place I could be because of the completeness and the unique experience that the poems render. I find continuing inspiration in this quality and seek it out in all art, as it seems to be the mark of an artist completely turned over to the medium, the scale of the subject matter demanding the effacement of the art maker. For me, Bhai Vir Singh opened up as an artist a door which the poet Khalid Matawa describes beautifully, to wit, the poem demands more of the poet than the ego can provide. A close look at the voice in Name Devotion Will illuminates the humbled and humbling voice that resonates with Matawa's keen observation. Your name, and the poem goes, your name was lodged forever on my tongue. Though you walked away, your devotion occupied my eyes, instructed by your will. Extend your lovesickness to us too, O beloved, if you will. I cannot forget you ever. My every bit stings with longing. Here we see Singh as both a poet of immense desire and microscopic focus. The speaker's desire for the beloved so strong that he or she turns each sense over to the beloved, so strong that even the beloved's lovesickness is an object of the speaker's desire. The use of exclamation here, the use again of plain-spoken syntax and commandeering language like lodged forever, occupied, and instructed in the face of abandonment, seen in language like longing, cannot forget, and walked away, shows the speaker's desire and longing is everlasting. That a name was lodged forever inside the speaker situates us in line 1 in a fascinating temporal space, where the beloved's name serves as a benchmark after which the speaker is situated in forever, as if the name ejected the speaker from linear time. This temporal setting mirrors the speaker's longing. It cannot be assuaged and so is never ending. That said, the tone of the last line is not despairing, but decidedly faithful. The emotional completeness of the speaker's longing rings of truth, which, if we define as something verifiable, then the way the beloved has occupied the speaker's senses makes the beloved one in the same with truth. That what wisdom in these lines. Without a moment's respite from tonal proximity, Singh renders the reality of longing and desire, that they are self-perpetuated in the face of a truth that overwhelms the senses. The speaker is in this way simply an instrument of the subject matter of the poem. Singh's choice of subject matter made a strong impression on me as a young writer. Experiencing poetry with a religious and or mystic subject matter, particularly out of rhyme and meter and without dogma, was completely new. These matters simply didn't come up in the work of Tony Hoagland or Dean Young without irony or humor. That wasn't the nature of popular poetry at the time. Again, Singh was an outsider who exploded my expectations. Not only were the poems visceral and dreamily cohesive, they were also employing these qualities as a matter of addressing mystical issues of faith, ego, and devotion. In terms of subject matter, Singh's work seemed to break all of the unspoken rules of poetry. It was spiritual without hesitation, devotional without irony, and directly addressed the beloved without being in any way sentimental. This is because love, devotion, and spirituality are not frivolous matters in Bhai Vir Singh's work and are treated with the dynamic attention and artistry required to render them as such. Singh's work does not pull away when the emotional work gets difficult. It soldiers inward, teaching the mind and the heart the mechanics of doing the same. We see this at work in the poem Beyond Time. My heart won't listen to me. It has reached a place, a timeless abode, in its wondrous minarets, without past or future. It loses itself. It returns dripping in love, but does not know or say anything. The closure here is a perfect example of the emotional density I've come to expect from Bhai Vir Singh's work. The speaker's love and desire here are laid out in a style familiar from the past two poems we looked at: an interior landscape, timeless and heart, vast and nebulous without past or future and a loss of self, but wild and beautiful. The heart has vanished in the vague and effacing landscape evoked by the stanza break before the concluding couplet, which emerges from the white space of the page, fulfilled entirely, saturated with love. Then the twist. but does not know anything. This is a moment that showcases Singh's portrayal of ecstatic love in its equal parts celebratory and demanding. That the speaker's heart can be completely filled with love and yet still unknowing and unable to speak points to the profound difficulty of devotion and love, both for the divine beloved as seen in named devotion will or in romantic love. Singh's charge is to continue to allow the heart to guide despite the fact that we cannot know where it leads exactly or whether or not we will necessarily reap anything tangible from its guidance. Singh's work resembles the poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke in this way. It demands us to look into the uncomfortable truths about our emotional and spiritual constitution. It illuminates what may be our shortcomings by illuminating a path of truth, a type of truth which, as part of its essence, is difficult to embrace and follow. Love, as we see it in beyond time and named devotion will, is inherently incomprehensible, and the speaker is a vessel unequipped to contain all of it. This type of love serves as an example of how Bhai Vir Singh's speakers are often both tuned into a profound inner life and aware of their own human shortcomings, a combination which allows his speakers to speak to the divine interior of the reader while still resonating on an everyday human level. Singh's speakers do not claim to understand. They long and hurt, and in the end, simply learn to deal with the ambiguities of life with love and devotion. Often, I find Bhai Vir Singh's delicate and nuanced treatment of complex subject matter is rooted in the fact that his poems aren't necessarily about one particular subject, neither outwardly narrative like O'Hara's poem, which could be quickly identified as a walking around New York poem, nor neatly categorizable as we often see Emily Dickinson's work into the subject of a lyric meditation about, say, time or death. Consider, for example, his poem, Love for the Ephemeral. My beloved, when we get fixed on things we look at, when we long for them, when we are seduced by beauty other than yours, when we emotionally invest in other sorrows and desires, we ache as they flee, for they are ephemeral. This poem serves as an example of the way that Bhai Vir Singh's poems aren't exactly about what we see or experience, but how we choose to experience whatever we may encounter. In this way, his work taught and continues to teach me to re-see what I thought I had understood, to reconnect the dots in life, in others' poetry and my own. As we see in Love for the Ephemeral, Singh's work seems to be interested above all in exercising the muscles of the spirit, ultimately bringing us to the point where joy, sorrow, devotion, abandonment are all imbued with the powerful music of the divine beloved. This does not mean that Bhai Vir Singh points us to hermitage or asceticism, quite the contrary. In lines 4 through 8, when we are seduced by beauty other than yours, when we emotionally invest in other sorrows and desires, we ache as they flee. The speaker points to the value of realization through experience. Realization as in realizing that you have been blinded or mistaken, confused, obsessed, in love, and coming to the threshold then of growth. When the speaker says ache in the penultimate line here, it isn't a cutting pain, but a desirous longing, a type of faith. Faith that confusion, sorrow, or becoming fixed on things we look at is as inevitable as it is ephemeral. In this way, Bhai Vir Singh's work is as infinite as its subject matter. No matter where it finds me in life, it suggests that there is more than I'm accounting for, suggests that the divine is synonymous with the fleetingness of certitude, because beyond what we know, Singh's work suggests there is an infinity of depth and vision. Thank you.